My name is Edward Cruz, and this video is going to be for my final game project for the class GAME-2341. So let's get to it. First, I'm going to be talking about my top-down character. And so I have here in Unreal Engine my top-down character, as you can see here in the viewport. And I have a sword mesh that I believe is tied. Yes, the parent socket is tied to the character's skeleton, specifically their right hand. And the sword, I gave it a child component of a capsule component, and that is what I'm using to detect collision. So if we go to the event graph where I have it commented out here, sword collision. So on component begin to overlap, I did try using the hit component, but I'm not 100% sure on how that system works and how it activates. And when I implemented this, I was already constrained for time, so I just went with something I knew and scrapped together like a delay to make it not happen every now and then, or continuously for that matter. So I do have checks for like whether or not the player is attacking to even go through this. If it's not, then it checks whether or not it's the burst. The burst ability is essentially like an ultimate skill, and I just have it to where it causes death because I never got to the point where I could implement the specific code on each enemy to deal with what the burst does. But essentially, I just have it working as like an ultimate move. So I gave it it's just an insta kill essentially. Let's see. Now I did load. I spent a lot of the time for this project specifically on the animation system, or at least trying to understand the animation system. The main character's model is the Unreal default model, Manny Simple skeletal mesh. So what I had to do was I had to rig it. I had to do like a bunch of rigging. I don't remember. There's the alt animation. Well, anyways, I have a bunch of retargeting rigs from the Quang model from Epic Games Paragon, or at least I guess that game doesn't exist anymore. But all their assets are in the store, so I retargeted those models to the default player model, so that I could use their animations on this model. So I did it for Quang and I did it for Aurora, because I basically ripped off their attack animations, but I didn't want to use their model, so I retargeted their skeletons to the mannequin so that I could use their attack combos. I believe I use Quang's for normal attack and Aurora's as a sort of like a heavy attack, and I use her E ability, I think, for the burst ability from the game. So that's where I get the animations from. Let's go look at the attack system now. So in event graph, we have the burst attack and the main attack here in event graph. Clean this up. So whenever the input for normal attack is pressed, which in this game it's left click, it does a check for whether or not burst or blocking is happening. I implemented sort of this last. I didn't have the foresight to think that I'd be checking a bunch of branches. If not, I would have looked more into state machines and how to do them in blueprints, because I think it's a thing in animations, but I'm not 100% sure. How would you go about it in a blueprint actor? So I store the last input that it gets, because normal and heavy essentially call the same function, and based off the input, whether it's left click or right click, is where I decide what to do. So then has the branch checking for not whether it's already attacking. If it's true, it saves attack. If it's false, it turns is attacking to on, and then starts the attack. Uh, starts the attack function. So they're basically the same on both. So now we go into the attack function, which has an input of the input press. This is where I do the check. This is what I was using for debugging. But essentially, I take the display name, which comes out to be like the IA, the input action underscore, whatever I named the actual input event. So this one I have, it's just a string that I gave a default value of the normal attack. So I'm just checking whether or not it's a normal attack. And based off of that, it's true or false. So if it is a normal attack, it gives out the normal montages, which is a variable I think I have stored on the player. Yeah. So here are my variables. Under my combo system area, I was trying to keep it organized because of how many variables there are. The normal montages and the heavy montages are map dictionaries, and so they store. I'm using an integer just to keep track of the int that they are, and the mapped element is the montage type. Is type of animation montage, and then I put the attack A, attack B, attack C, attack D that the paragon assets had. So when we go into the combo function, I pass in the combo animation, and the attack counter is what specifies the integer from that map dictionary to be used. So in here on the switch, attack counter is being called, and based off of what it currently is at, it calls then the next animation montage. So and it sets the next integer right before that. So I had to make a temp to be able to call the actual current, because I believe it plays the montage, and if I tried setting the integer after, it would not. It just wouldn't do it. So I don't know what's going on in like the blueprint VM for it to not call the next executable thing. I don't know if it waits for the animation to play out. I'm not 100% sure. So I just call the specific integer, and then I pass in the anim montage into the play montage node. And that should be it for the combo. I do have a second event graph here called combo events. Now, I believe these are called from the animation blueprint. So this saves attack, or it checks to see if save attack is true. If it is, save attack gets checked to false. And then it calls the attack thing again, the attack function again. Reset combo just resets the combo. This takes place whenever the animation finishes. So for that to happen in the montages themselves, here, they have a little node within the scene graph. So I have a keyframe called save attack and a keyframe called reset combo, specifically in the animation for it to take place. So once it reaches frame 18, we save the attack, and then within this window, you want to click the next. You want to click whatever if you want to attack again, because by the time it reaches reset combo, it's no longer possible. The animation is going to finish playing out, and if you hit attack again, it will start at the very first move of the combo. And so that's how I've been keeping track of whether to continue the combo or not. All the animations do that. All the montages do that. So I had to get the Quang animations to work, I just reused the one that they provided with the Quang model. And rather than casting a Quang, I cast it to the top-down character. Did the dispatcher myself. Then I think I left all this. I'm not 100% sure what most of this stuff does. I'm not sure if it's taking effect. I have an idea of what it does because I spent like more than a day trying to parse through all this, but I'm not 100% sure if it's actually doing all that on the mannequin model specifically. And then down here was the other stuff I had to edit, so I had to move these aside and do it to the player instead. Reset combo and combo attack save. These are when the animation montage is playing, it calls these events the keyframes, and then I cast to the player and call the events to attack save and reset combo. So we have the ground locomotion here. So like on the anim graph, this takes care of like the leaning and running around, stuff like that. And it does a bunch of like offset bodies because you can attack while you're moving, specifically why I reused because it looked janky on the own version I tried doing, which wasn't as complicated. So I just decided to reuse theirs because it looked better. And I had like animations canceling each other out and stuff like that. So now to look into the burst attack, here I have again the checks. After I had to do this across multiple abilities, that's when I was thinking about doing state machines, but I was very time constrained and I only had these specific features to add. If I had to add any more, I definitely would try not doing this anymore. I have the boolean for the can burst, the function for attack burst, and then I start a timer and I pass in the animation time. So this does work. I was having problems with that on the enemy, which I'll show later. But it sets is attacking a false, can burst false, plays the animation, which is the burst attack. It's a montage I made, but it's essentially ability E animation from Aurora's player model. And then we play a sound. We spawn an emitter. It's for the visual and sounds. Get the location, set is burst happening to true. And then I pass in the time of the animation to the return node. And when we come back to the return node, it gets set into the timer. This timer gets set when the timer finishes playing out. It calls this event function and sets is burst happening to false. So burst happening will be true during the duration of the actual animation. And then after this timer set, though, the execution keeps going before the timer even finishes and sets this timer, which is the burst cooldown. This is so that the player can't spam the burst at all. So I believe it's 5 seconds. Yeah. So the burst cooldown is 5 seconds, and then I made it into a variable, the timer handler. And when this timer runs out, it resets burst, which is just a boolean, is how I'm keeping track. Which does this check, can burst at the beginning to see whether or not we can do it or not. So then we got the block ability here, and the block ability does its checks again right here for whether or not it's attacking or the burst is going on. If it's false, then it does do the block, so I set that to true. And I really got tired of wasting my time on animations. I'm not an animator. I prefer programming and only programming. And so I just completely got rid of the whatever, like play montage and stuff like that due to the time constraints, because I spent way too much time with this project just delving into animation blueprints. And not being an animator, it's kind of a struggle because then I have zero assets to even mess around with. I gotta find them, stuff like that. So here we got a cube that I gave to the player. And essentially, I have this cube set to invisible, 0 collision. And then I set the visibility. Or, my bad. the collision stuff I did somewhere else. On here, it looks like I didn't have to do that. So this cube appears whenever the block input is being used, and that's how you visually know that you're blocking. And whenever the action is canceled or completed, there's a weird thing for the input action where I have it set to hold, but for some reason there's like a threshold, and I didn't want to mess with it anymore. So I figured out that canceled happens before the threshold is met, and completed happens after. Because there'd be a weird problem where if I held it after the threshold, it would stay, and I'd have to click it again and get rid of it, stuff like that. So started works consistently as long as you press a button, and then canceled or completed sets it to false and hides the cube again. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the enemies. So what I really want to do was practice to see how Unreal Engine does a object-oriented programming with their blueprints, and because you can always see in a blueprint they have a parent class, and it's usually actor if it's like some random level object you're going to use, or it stems off of like character, pawn, stuff like that. So I wanted to see if I could make my own user-defined class and start my own parent and child relationship with their system. In using blueprints specifically. I've done it in C++, but I wanted to see how it worked with blueprints. So I got the did I not open it? Did I just close it? You have the enemy base class here. So enemy base class is practically just a bunch of template stuff. So I have a capsule collider because it's the parent to the enemy base class is a character, so I get all the character functionality. I added the pawn sensing. I added the cube. This cube I ended up using for attack because for some reason I couldn't get the play montages to work on their animation blueprints. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong there, but it just wouldn't overwrite whatsoever. No matter what I did. So the character comes with the mesh, character mesh, stuff like that, and I have the health bar component so that they have a health bar when you play in game. So here you'll have an event graph. So at event begin play, we update the health bar. This basically sets like the component stuff for the UI element. So we call health bar, which is the component widget. Use wizard object. We cast to the widget, and then we set the health variable within that widget, which is tied to the slider value because it's essentially a progress slider. And what I'm taking is because the progress uses a float between 0 and 1. I take the current health and the max health and I normalize the range and pass that into the health, so I don't have to do anything on the widget side. I just do it on the enemy itself. So then we set can attack to true. This wasn't. I don't think I need this, but I just left it so I wouldn't break anything. But I think I used that to test something. We set the visibility of the cube to false, and we update the HUD counter. So this is something for the debugger, or no, the HUD specifically. And essentially, I am casting to the top-down player, and I had to go this roundabout way to get it because the HUD is tied to the player specifically. So I had to get player controller, then player state to get player character. I don't know why I needed to go through all that. So I call the HUD variable I have on there because I have the HUD stored on the player, and then I call a dispatcher and I send in whether or not it's an add or not. So an event begin play is add is true, and I believe I just checked the box and where's here. Yeah, I just checked the box. So on event begin play, this is true, and then I call that again in the death function. But on pawn sensing, it's very rudimentary AI. I just check to see if the player is seeable, and then I call the follow player event. I check whether it can attack. Sees the player is true. I call the AI move to. There is a nav mesh on the map, so it just navigates, and this node knows what to do. So Unreal Engine makes that fairly easy. And then the target actor is the character, which I can just get. So I don't know why I was having trouble with that earlier. Once it succeeds, meaning that like it's in the acceptable radius. I check whether or not it can attack, just in case for whatever reason it can't. We call the attack function. So here in the attack function, I do set it to false, and then I do a check for a random integer between 0 and 100 that I call. So if the integer is greater than 20 and less than 30, and those both evaluate to true, we set the cube visibility. So that red cube you saw earlier in the parent function here, or the parent class, we set the cube to visible. We set the collision to query only. And this is so that because I'm using an overlap event, so I need in case the player is always in the cube, even when it's not visible, it doesn't affect anything. And then because I couldn't get the animation montage, I do know that the animation was lasting 1.1 seconds. It just wasn't passing the reference to the return node for some reason. Very, very weird. I manually do it. So I set the attack timer to 1.1 here. And then because if it's false, like if I don't hit it, I don't want the attack timer to be anything. And then I pass in whatever the attack timer is, depending on either of these. So then we go back. So once it gets called out, attack timer, I do pass it in to the return node. Okay, so that's pretty much why I made it a variable, is because for some reason, I guess it has to do with the child and parent relationship. This reference doesn't keep its it loses its reference somehow. So if I pass anim time, it's always 0 no matter what. And I don't know why that is. Even if it was coming straight out of the play animation montage, even that was 0. It just wasn't keeping the reference. Maybe it has to do with the return node. I'm not 100% sure. So I just store it in the variable that's stuck to the enemy. And then I do the delay on that. So the delay is so that the attack can like play out visually. After it's done, we set the cube to false, turn off the collision. Can attack is true again. And we update the rotation. So I had to do this because 150 for the radius is pretty big, and the character could just run around behind the player and stay within the radius so that the AI move never activates, and then you could just sit behind the enemy. So to combat that, I have update rotation, which is a zone function, and it just casts to the player real quick and does a final look at rotation between the player capsule and the capsule component of the enemy. We get world rotation, lerp it. So from the enemy's world rotation to the look rotation, and then the shortest path, we do a lerp rotator, and we set the world rotation on the enemy. So then we got on component begin overlap for the cube. So this is essentially the same stuff as like the sword on the player. So if the cube is visible, we cast to the player, or more like the other actors inputted. So if it is the player, it casts to the player, because this node has to basically match the type that it can take. We check for whether or not the player is blocking here, and we subtract health. So this is the subtract health on the player side, which I don't think we've looked at yet. So this takes in a damage integer, checks whether or not God mode is enabled. This is a debugging thing. Current health minus the damage that was applied. Update current health. If it's, and then it does a check for whether or not it's less than or equal to 0. If it is, we call the death function. If not, we just update the health bar on the player. And we also spawn an emitter, which is essentially what I'm using for like a hit function, like a hit visual for whenever the player gets hit, and the sound of the player getting hit. This is just random. I'm using a bunch of stuff from like Infinity Blade particles. So I think currently it's like like an ice thing, which makes no sense, but it's visually representational just for me. And so then now that is the parent class. It's basically everything. We have a bunch of variables here. We got this attribute as well. And so basically the reason for these is that now on the child, you can reset those. So on begin play for the tank specifically, this is me trying to just get the animation thing to work. Never did. So the max health is at, I think the default is 100. On the tank, it's specifically 150. Update current health, and then I set max walk speed on the character movement component to 450. So the tank is a little bit slower. And I believe death. So I ended up using the same thing on all of them. So I could have just had this in the parent function. But just in the offset chance that I wanted to customize it, which I ended up not doing because I didn't waste time exploring that. They all do the AU shield spawn and explosion sound. So you'll see that when I play. But essentially what we got here is this is a neat thing about parent-child relationship. I can call the death function, which is, I believe, an override from, yes, it's an override from the death function in the parent function, in the parent class. So I can call this before it runs the node from the parent of the death function. So the parent function, we are now in the base class. I have death running update HUD counter. This is and it's false. So this is to update like how many enemies are on the screen. It just essentially dispatches out. But it gives a false, so the UI knows how to increment. So here, I essentially did that with this. I never updated this comment. And then we destroy actor. So the destroy actor is the only thing I kept because, I mean, it's their death. I need to destroy actor, so I just left them the parent class. So specifically in the enemy tank, and I believe also in the minion and enemy range, they're basically the same. And I call it before the code that executes in the parent function, which I found that neat. You can decide whether or not to do it after or before whatever runs, which because the parent has the destroy actor, I need to do it before any code in here. As you can see here real quick, the red cube is the size of their attack. So for the tank, it's pretty small. Meanwhile, on the enemy minion, it's a little bit longer. And on the ranged, it is very long. So I didn't want to waste any time actually spawning like a projectile or something. So I just made it to where it's pretty big. Also, I probably should have done this, but I needed to change the acceptance radiance. The AI move to, it's on the parent. So that's just a float value. So I'd probably just make it in the parent a variable and then set it in the begin play on the enemy type and whatnot. Change the radius for the AI move to function, the acceptance radius. Something to do later. So now that you've seen the enemies, we have a enemy spawner blueprint. So this is very simple. I believe it's just a cylinder, and I have some weird material I found that does that to it. Don't know how that works. It was just part of the engine, and I thought it was neat, so we use that. So here in event graph on begin play, I made a special struct called debug enemy spawn data. So in this struct, I made some variables. It's a text, a class reference to the enemy base class, and a spawner reference variable for the specific spawner object reference. So essentially, this struct holds data that I will need for like UI stuff, which I'll show here in a sec. But these are variables on the actual spawn actor. And so what I'm doing is I'm setting, I also have the struct variable here. So what I do is I set it at beginning, give it title text, give the reference and a reference to itself in the spawner reference. And then I bind an event dispatcher called onSpawnPressed. This is specifically for the debugger. And so the event on that occurs is I will have a number to spawn. This number is based off of what you input in the text box, and I'll do a for loop running through the number to spawn, and I'll spawn the enemy that is tied to the variable. And this was just for debugging, but it just spawns at the transform of the spawner. Alright, so moving on to UI. I got pretty infatuated with UI recently, so I spent most of these last days working on that and making it look a little bit more prettier, presentable. Just using the stock stuff in Unreal. I didn't go out of my way to use a different program. But here's the health bar that the player uses, and it's basically the same as the enemy health bar, just a different color for the progress bar. Not much to that. It's just literally sitting there, and the only thing I update is the actually, no, the logic isn't even in here. I just have a variable here, and this variable is tied to the get percent function. And that's it. So the logic for it is handled on the player and the enemy in their subtract health classes. So moving on, here we have the HUD. So for the HUD, it was more of informational value because of how this is a prototype. So essentially, there's not much of a game mode going on either. So I did want to know how many enemies were in the level to keep track of it. That's what the update HUD function does on the enemies. So this text here does get updated by this function. So I have a formatted text string manipulation here. So I just have enemies, and then I use I forget what it's called, but anything you put in the curly braces becomes like an output pin or an input pin on this here thing, which is pretty neat because if I just get rid of this, see the pin disappears. But if I do curly braces, if it's empty, it treats it the same. That's pretty neat. But here we have num left, and then I just pass in whatever variable. I guess it C++ wise, I guess it's the same as using an auto, because it takes literally whatever pin you put in it, and I guess it does all the conversion it needs to convert it into text automatically in this node thing. I don't know what else it does, but it does say what arguments it can take. Byte, integer, float, text, string, name, boolean, object, any text, gender, whatever that is. I've never seen that. Anyways, we do have buttons on the HUD. So as you can see in the designer window, I have a reset level, and it's basically just a restart and a quit. So you can leave the game this way. I probably should have made this into like a pause menu, but yeah, I didn't think about that. So in the graph, we do have on event construct, we're binding that update counter thing for the enemies. So this is the increment decrement logic based off of the boolean that's passed in. So on begin play on the enemy, it's true, and on the other one it's false when death happens, so it knows what to do for the enemy counter. That's how it keeps track of that. On clicked reset button. So this is for the reset level. We just get the current level name, and then it converts from a string to a name object, and we pass it into the open level by name reference, and it does what it needs to do, and then the quit button just quits game node, and that's it. Quits the game. Moving on to the debugger. So the debugger I spent quite a bit of time on perfecting. So here is just the title text so that the person using it knows what to do with it, knows what it is. Reset player health is a button, so this will just reset the player's health. Restart level does the same thing that the HUD has. I had this here before I implemented the HUD. God mode is a checkbox. This makes the there's a check for the subtract player function, and if this is true, essentially it doesn't let that logic to happen. It stops at the if statement. And then I have a scroll box here, so spawner is available. So I do have level code, and in the level code I get all actors of the spawner class reference, cast to the player, call the debug HUD, loop through all the actors that were found, and because the actors have the spawn data reference, I just pass that into the update list event, which is tied to the debugger. It's a custom event. So the UI widget for the debugger, I have a variable here called widget list, and the update list just adds that data struct to the list. So, and then I update the debugger whenever the list gets updated, and the update debugger is just right above here. And so what I do is I clear all the children in the scroll box. I loop through the list that is currently there. Pass in the data struct for when I create the spawner template. This data struct takes care of a lot of stuff. So I set the text that is there on the template, this text here. I set that with the text that we passed in on that data struct earlier, and then the spawn button uses that spawner's reference. So because we have a reference to the spawner that was passed in, it knows I can call on the spawn pressed event that's on it, and the number to spawn, which I get from here whenever the text box is updated in here. This variable is set, and then I just pass in this variable to get sent into the dispatcher. So back to the debugger, and then we add the children. So very, very neat. Works very fast too. I'm honestly surprised. Observer pattern, essentially what the event dispatchers are, it's pretty neat. Decouples a lot of stuff and makes things a lot easier. Barely any nodes. The only problem is that it's a little bit of everywhere. To me, it's easier to read in C++, but I mean, it wasn't an option. So, what else do we got? Here, I've only talked about these two nodes. So here on the debugger, this is where we take care of the logic for God mode. I just cast to the player and set that boolean to true that's on the player. Safety wise, this is probably, I don't know how you would implement a debugger on like an actual team scenario. It would have to be like a decoupled system, in the sense where the player is always calling to the debugger system, and the God mode would be on the debugger system manager or something, rather than on the player. Because if somebody could hack the game, they could just flip the value on the boolean. So that's not safe at all, but I guess you just did that. This is the reset player button. We cast to the player again. I get the max health. I set the current health to whatever the max health is on the player. I left this abstract in case I ever change the values or whatnot. And then we update the health bar so that the visual representation takes place. Because I had this before and I realized that when I clicked the button, it didn't update until I got hit again. And then we have the reset level, which is the same as what we have in the HUD. So this here is just a border box. I spent some time designing this because I thought it was pretty cool. Border boxes are neat. So this is literally just a template, and I have to have this variable exposed on spawn, so that I can pass it in with the when I create it. So I can pass in that data object that I get from the widget list array. Alright, so I guess I'll go ahead and show the game now. So here I have it in full screen so you can see a pretty good view of it. We got the HUD always on over here in the left. And the controls are shown right under it. We have for movement, WASD controls. For combo A, left clicking, combo B, right clicking. Burst attack is F. Blocking is middle mouse, and the debug menu is opened with tab. So, hitting tab and opening up the debug menu, we have the reset player health button, restart level, god mode, and then the spawners available section. So, and then we got all the 4 spawners in the level. So there's one in each corner in the map. There's one. Minion spawner 2 is this one. This one over here should be the tank spawner, and range spawner is up top right. Alright, so we're gonna start spawning in enemies here. And as you can see, there's their AI working. They can track me pretty good. They can go around objects. And this guy's a little bit faster than the rest. And there's the semi-rotation. Every now and then he'll attack. There's me coming from the hit. There's me. Oh. I should probably add a delay for not getting hit so many times. There's the enemy death. Here is a player health resetting. So now my health is 100% again. We can restart the level. We can turn on God mode. And let's spawn in a tank this time. As you can see, the enemies thing gets updated in the HUD. So the tank runs at a speed of 450, I believe. There's his attack. And those ice particles are the emitter happening whenever I get hit. And as you can see with God mode on, I didn't lose any health, even though I got hit there. And let me show off the ranged enemy. The ranged enemy, I couldn't get the animation blueprint to work properly. So I did get rotation work, all that does. I just couldn't get the blend space to actually apply to the skeleton. I don't know if I'm using the wrong mesh. And then this enemy is just a 2-hit. They have small health. Easy to kill, but their range is long if they decide to attack, as you can see. So now let me show off, just spawn in a bunch of enemies here. Now you can see there's 51 enemies and the game's lagging pretty bad. Okay. So as you can see there, I died. That's so loud. As you can see there, I died. Let's just do 5 this time. Now we got 5 enemies on the screen. And the level gets restarted whenever the player does. So then we got reset level over here, that works, and there's also the quit button. So, and just to be sure, because I don't think I showed it, so we can spawn one enemy, the counter goes up, this enemy comes in, if I kill him, it should go back down to 0. Back down to 0. Let's show off the burst attack. Actually, we can do 10. And then they should all just die. I didn't hit the spawn button. There we go. So there are 10 in there. They spawn very quickly. So as you can see, they're like multiplying. So there is 10 in there. So let me try to get. Oh, okay. That's what God mode's for. We can kill all 10 enemies with the burst ability since it's an insta kill. So there's 10 enemies there. And there you go. Back down to 0. So the burst ability insta kills everything. And that's all I got for this prototype. As you can see, I can cycle through all the hit combos. So right now I'm right clicking. It just cycles through 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. I can mix match. Oh, blocking. I almost forgot. So let's spawn another enemy. So this is the blocking ability. As this is up, I can't get hit, essentially. So if the enemy decides to attack... Oh, okay. So I took damage there because I wasn't blocking. So I do not take damage as long as I'm blocking. But as soon as I let go, whenever it does attack, it should apply. Okay, it seems to only apply if I move while the attack's happening. That has to do with the overlap event. I need to figure out how Unreal Engine uses that hit event, because I believe that's how most people do it. And that's all I got to show, so thank you for watching if you made it this far.